Go ahead and get started while the guys are finishing up in there and do our announcements at least. And if you didn't get a bulletin, please pick one of those up. There's seemingly lots of things going on here in the coming weeks. Tonight is game night here at the building, 5:30. So anybody that's inclined to join us here. The ladies are invited to our house on the 4th for time of fun and fellowship and whatever all you'll get involved with there. Let's see, there's the harvest dinner is coming up. I think that's 3 weeks from now, the 13th. That's always a wonderful time of fellowship, so be planning on that. There's usually a sign-up sheet that goes up on the bulletin board to sign up for fixings for the dinner, so be planning for the harvest dinner on November 13th at 5:30. That's the Sunday, I think, of our normal fellowship meal, but we'll not have that and instead do the evening time dinner. So some events coming up to be planning for there. Information, there's also a work day coming up here this Saturday. I don't know that good morning. I don't know that we've hammered out details. I think we were planning around 9-ish to get started. Does that sound right, Michael? Did we say 9 o'clock Saturday? Does that sound like 8 o'clock? No, that's fine by me. Dave will be here at 8, so so if you're inclined to help out, there's just lots of things in and around the building that could use some attention. Fixed the building up nice here a couple years ago. We want to keep it that way. So if you're inclined to help out, I'm assuming we get early start that will be done early afternoon, and you'll have the rest of your day to do whatever. So plan on that as well. There's information in the bulletin about pantry needs and some other sundry things. Couple of exciting pieces of information to share. First, it's in the bulletin. Carrie Jo had her baby girl this past week, so congratulations to Rob and Kara for their first grandbaby. So I'm sure they're very excited. Hopefully Kara got over her cold so that she's able to love on her a little bit. The other good news is that last Sunday, Jacob and Aaron and Brooks Wolfgang placed membership here at the church in New Brighton. And it's their desire to work with us here. So I'm especially excited about that. But they will be, I believe, a blessing to the church here. And hopefully we can look for ways to be blessings to them. So anyhow, that was exciting news. When they moved to the area they moved into, I just assumed that they would likely be worshiping at Zelienople, since it's proximity-wise much closer. But they've chosen to be here and join us. So we're excited about that. And look forward to you all getting to know them a little bit better. We all have favorite people in our lives one way or another, and Jacob Wolfgang is one of those. His spirit is just very much one that he's in touch with God and in touch with people in general, and hopefully you'll get to see and feel that a little bit. So anyhow, excited to announce that as well. Lots of folks to be praying for. The Waltons obviously are in South Carolina. for their family wedding. So Craig will be filling in this morning as far as delivering our message during our worship time. Craig will also be taking over class starting next Sunday. So I have not talked to him specifically about what he has in store for that class topic, but I'm sure it'll be well worth our continued coming and participating in that. So that obviously that means we're winding things up here today with what we've been doing. It doesn't seem possible that I shared this similar series back in 2005. So 17 years ago, we went through a very similar discussion. And I've lost track of how many weeks and months it's been since we started this time, honestly. So I hope it has been a benefit to you in as it has to me as we've been going through some of the evidence that we have to support Christianity, to realize and know that this is not just a blind faith that we have, that there's support for it. Wanted to start our last lesson today deals with the post-resurrection appearances of Christ, because those are important, I think, as well. Important evidence. Came across a story in 1963. Addie Mae Collins was a young African-American girl, one of 4 people that was tragically killed in a church bombing in Birmingham. Some racist individual blew up an African-American church in Birmingham and killed 4 people. And little Addie Mae Collins was one of those. So she was buried in 1963 in a cemetery, and for 35 years, her family members went to the grave site, would pray, leave flowers, and do what family members do at cemeteries. 35 years later, I don't know the details why, but they decided that they were going to move her remains to a different location. So they dug up her grave and were surprised to find that there was nothing there, that her remains weren't there. There were no remains there. So, of course, that turned into frantic looking for answers. Many possible solutions were proposed. The most logical seemed to be they had put the grave marker at the wrong spot. But in this, nobody suggested that little Addie Mae Collins resurrected. Right? That was not even suggested in this situation, because an empty grave, in and of itself, does not mean there was a resurrection. Right? So we spent last week talking about the empty tomb and how important that was. And it is important, extremely important. But an empty tomb all by itself does not mean resurrection. Right? The fact that Jesus appeared following that resurrection is hugely important. In fact, reading through some of the scientists and things that I was reading about. One of them was, the empty tomb isn't even really all that important, he proposed. The fact that we know he died and the fact that we saw him alive afterwards is really all we needed. We didn't even need the fact that the empty tomb, that was gravy, that was just icing on the cake and helpful. But really, the 2 important things were, and we established a couple of weeks ago, medically speaking, that he died. The other options that are proposed out there just don't hold water. So we know he was dead, and we know we saw him afterwards, and that is important. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We've been in this chapter a couple times recently, and I've shared that it's one of my favorites. We are at the end of the chapter, in fact, last week. And we're going to be at the beginning of the chapter here this morning. The first few verses of chapter 15, Paul describes, explains exactly what the gospel is. We know the gospel means the good news, but here he gets specific with what that gospel really is. And it takes him several sentences with a bunch of add-ons to describe, but basically it comes down to the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, right? That's what the good news boils down to. And starting in verse 1. Now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, in which also you stand, by which you are saved, if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures. And now we'll get into the meat of what we're going to look at here this morning. And that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now. But some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as it were, to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. Paul goes through and lists several people, in fact, in one case, 500 people at one time, that Jesus appeared to after he had been crucified, after he was dead, after that tomb was found empty. He appeared to all of these people. This is important because many, I guess the accepted dates, in fact, would place the writing of 1 Corinthians earlier in history than even the Gospels. That it's accepted the dates for the writing of 1 Corinthians are prior to even the writings of the Gospels. So this may be, in history speaking anyhow, the earliest documentation of post-resurrection appearances of Christ. Now, it's funny, again, the skeptics are going to try to cast doubt on a variety of things. One of them being the fact that this is the only reference we have in Scriptures, or the only reference they've found anywhere, historically speaking, to the appearance to the 500 people at one time. The Gospels don't recount that for us. So Paul's reference here is the only place we find this that he appeared to 500 people at one time after his death. So skeptics would point to that and say, well, this is the only place that it happened, so therefore it must not have happened. Really. So just because only one person recounts something, that means that is false, especially since this is the earliest probably documented case of it. I think there needs to be a lot more than just that to cast doubt on this. He also mentions, I believe, the appearance to James. I'm not sure that the gospel necessarily, I can't think of them anyways, of the Gospels recounting the appearance just to James, like Paul does here in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But it's important for us to look at and to see these appearances. I guess it's important to note we don't have specific historical record of somebody physically being there and witnessing the moment that Jesus' body came back to life, right? Nobody was there at that precise moment to write down and document or video that exact moment. But again, we don't need that to happen. The fact that he appeared to people afterwards is important. We take a look at the list of appearances. Folks, in addition to what Paul writes here, some of them in addition, but if we go down, we know that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. We talked about that last week. And the fact that it was a woman that first appeared, that first saw him, is important. Because if this story was made up, we talked about how the fact, if it was just made up, they would not have made it up with that detail probably, right? We talked about the standing of women in that culture and how her testimony wouldn't have been accepted by itself in a court of law. That being a woman, she didn't have that standing to testify. So if somebody were to make this story up, they would not have made it up with Mary and the other women being the ones that saw him first. They would have taken some of the other details out of the story. Like we know that Peter and John came to the tomb, right? Those would have been the ones that were given credit for finding the body. If this story was just a made up story. But we know that he appeared to Mary Magdalene in John chapter 20. To the other women that we discussed last week, again, it seemed like maybe there's some contradictions in the stories because Matthew's account lists some people and Mark's account lists others and Luke's I'm not sure why it's hard to just realize that they were all there. Right? That there was Mary Magdalene, there was Mary the mother of Jesus, there was, who else did? Johanna was mentioned in one of the accounts. Who am I forgetting? There was another name of one of the women listed in another account. Why couldn't they have all been there? In fact, I think they were all there, right? It's just one of those details. So Matthew 28, we know that there were other women there. Luke chapter 24 gives us the account of Cleopas, who's the only one that's named, but remember there was another disciple. There were two disciples that were on the road to Emmaus, following on that Resurrection Sunday, right? And Jesus came and he walked along with them, and for a time they didn't recognize him. And Luke describes that account in Luke 24, verses 13 through 32. It gives quite a bit of detail about this walk and the conversation they had, and then once they got to the house, the continued conversation that they had before they eventually finally realized who it was that they were walking and talking with this whole time. So Cleopas is named, but there was a second disciple that was there as well that was not named. We find that in Luke chapter 24. Luke chapter 24, then the following verses, starting in 33 through 49, he appears to the 11 disciples that are left. Remember, Judas has already taken his life. So the 11 disciples that are left, and there seems to be others that were there as well in Luke 24, 33 through 49. John chapter 20, verses 19 through 23, he appears to the 10 apostles minus Thomas. Thomas apparently wasn't there in that first case. And then in John chapter 20, verses 26 through 30, he appears to Thomas and the other apostles. John chapter 21, verses 1 through 14, he appears to some of the apostles. I think 7 of them were described. Matthew chapter 28, he appears to the disciples. Then there's the account right before the ascension that he was with the apostles prior to that account. So those are all the ones that are listed through the gospel accounts of Jesus appearing to individuals, a few individuals, or groups of individuals. In addition to that, we already read from 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul includes a few others. That he appeared to James, that he appeared to 500 people at one time. So we have the fact that Jesus appeared to many people following his resurrection. So what are the alternatives? If you're not going to believe that Jesus resurrected, what are the alternatives? Well, I've really only come up with a couple in my research recently. And the first possibility that's posed is that these appearances are legendary, that they're made up, right? And we've talked about this throughout in different aspects of this series. Reasons that doesn't hold water. But when we go back to the 1 Corinthians 15 that I read, and this is, I think, hugely important because it drives home the point that we would have even if Paul doesn't bring it up, honestly. But where was it? Verse 6. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain till now. Right? As Paul's writing this letter, he's telling the people, most of the people that saw him are still alive. And that's hugely important. Because if this was made up, he wouldn't have brought this up, right? Because somebody that was skeptical would now come, all right, tell me who some of these people are. I want to go talk to them, right? People were still alive when this was written that could verify this. Even if he didn't bring this up, right? There was already the ones that were listed in the gospel accounts that, and this is true, like I said, throughout many of the different pieces of evidence that we've looked at. There was the opportunity for skeptics back then to call into question many of these pieces of evidence that we've looked at. And the fact that they didn't is quite telling, right? The fact that they didn't back then question. It's not until much later in history that we start finding a lot of these alternative suggestions for what people think maybe really happened. And there's a reason for that, because it takes time for legends. I read one thing a couple of weeks ago as part of this study. They estimate it takes basically 2 generations for legends to get going. Why is that? Well, it takes time for the people that were alive when the story really happened to die off, right? Once those people die off and there's nobody left to corroborate what happened, that's when all of the extra details start getting added to the story. Or taken away from the story, whatever it might be. As we've already established, these Gospels and the book of 1 Corinthians were written so close to the time of Christ actually being alive. There was not time for legends to start developing yet. There were still too many people alive that could corroborate what was seen and heard. There just wasn't time for legends to have developed yet at that early stage. The second possibility that I've heard proposed, and it's probably less convincing than the first one, was that the appearances were hallucinations. That doesn't even really make a whole lot of sense to me. It's probably possible for me to hallucinate. It's possible for Carl to hallucinate. But are we going to hallucinate the exact same things? Probably not likely, right? And when do most hallucinations occur? I was reading one medical thing that when you're on drugs, you hallucinate. When you're in extreme stress and anxiety, maybe. There was a few things posed for when people hallucinate. But again, you're asking large numbers of people to have exactly the same hallucination on multiple accounts, on multiple occasions. This wasn't just one appearance at one time that we could have maybe all been tripping out and saw the same thing happen that didn't really happen. But this happened multiple times. I'm not sure that we even need to spend a whole lot of time defending that argument. It just doesn't seem to even make a whole lot of sense. That's the best that they can come up with for these accounts. They're either legends or people are hallucinating. They didn't really see them. And neither of those hold nearly the amount of water that the facts that we've just presented over time present. Comments or questions or thoughts? I wanted to spend just a few minutes basically summing up what we've looked at here over the last few months. But anything about the post-resurrection appearances specifically that catches your attention or stands out to you? Yeah. Yeah, good point. Anything else stand out at you? All right, so in our last 15 minutes or whatever, just to kind of summarize everything that we've looked at here throughout this series, we started off looking at eyewitness evidence. When we read through the Gospels specifically, because those are the books that account for the life and the teachings of Jesus specifically, these guys were eyewitnesses. There's not much better evidence that a prosecutor could look for, right? They want to know, was there somebody there that saw that? Not just somebody. Is this a reliable somebody? Does this somebody have some kind of axe to grind? Does this somebody have something to gain from this testimony? Is this somebody that we can trust based on their past and the kind of person that they have proven to be over time? Is this somebody that is believable? And we went through eyewitness evidence for a couple of weeks, and we looked at the writers and how the evidence overwhelmingly supports that, first of all, the people that we're claiming wrote these books did write these books, and that these people pass all the tests for eyewitnesses that somebody would look for, even to the point that they didn't leave out, in some cases, embarrassing information, about themselves, and how at the Last Supper they're arguing over who's the greatest. I think if I were to write an account of the last evening I had with the Messiah and how I got to eat supper with him, I would have left out that I was arguing with my brothers over which one of us was the coolest, right? I'd have left those details out. That would have been something I'd have hidden. And on we can go with things that are recorded about themselves. The fact that they ran away. The fact that they, betrayed him. The fact that they should have understood a lot more than what they really did. And I say should because I wouldn't have understood either. But they should have known a whole lot more than what they really ended up knowing at that point. There's a lot of things in there that I would have just left lay. But they bring it up, right? And they are very, they don't leave anything out. The fact that there's some seeming contradictions that some would say is simply only bolsters the truth, the fact that what they're speaking is truth, because the fact of the matter is you take any four individuals and ask them to explain events that they are all there for, they're not going to explain it exactly the same. And if they did, that would call into question their testimony, that they probably had already gotten together ahead of time and worked out these details in their fabrication. So the eyewitness testimony we looked at for a couple of weeks. We looked at the documentary evidence. We compared, we established that these guys were eyewitnesses and that what they wrote was true, that they intended it to be true. That was an important thing. Some people claim they didn't even intend this to be taken as truth. They were just kind of writing a fairy tale or whatever. And we squashed that these guys were eyewitnesses, that we do have their accounts. And then we looked at documentary evidence. Some people then cast doubt on, okay, so let's say those guys back then did write the truth, but how do we know that 2,000 years later that this is still what they wrote? And we spent a couple of weeks hammering that down and comparing the documentary evidence for the Bible compared to other ancient writings of antiquity, basically comparing how many different languages those were translated into, how many different copies that we're able to find, how far spread apart are these copies, when were they written, in every account. The Bible has so much more evidence. Instead of others that have just a couple of manuscripts or even maybe a couple of hundred, the Bible has over 25,000 manuscripts in several ancient languages, as opposed to maybe just one or two for some of these other writings of antiquity. Real important one. How close to the original writings are these manuscripts that we find? For some of these, hundreds of years elapses between when their author originally wrote them and when the earliest manuscript of these things is found. Hundreds of years. The Bible, some people narrow it down as low as 8 years, but just a few decades at the very worst, as opposed to hundreds of years elapsed between when the writers wrote their letters, their books, whatever we want to call them, and when the earliest manuscripts of those, the earliest copies of those has been found. That's huge. Again, there's not enough time that elapsed for legends. There's too many people still alive that could contradict the things that they're saying, right? So that's important. But again, nobody historically doubts things like the Annals of Imperial Rome that Tacitus wrote. Nobody doubts the authenticity of the Jewish war that Josephus wrote. Nobody doubts that Homer wrote the Iliad. And the evidence is overwhelmingly better for our Bible than any of these. So why would anybody doubt the authenticity of it, the validity of it, that what we have today is truly what was originally written? As part of that, we looked at some studies that were done that showed that the scriptures that we have today are 99.5% pure, which means 99.5% exactly what was originally written 2,000 years ago. And of that 0.5%, it's spelling differences, orders of words that are different in the copying. And the orders of words, remember back in Koine Greek, doesn't even matter. It doesn't change the meaning of the sentence when you change the order. So anyhow, we say it's 99.5% pure. That really means it's pure, right? Because you mess up spelling of a word, okay, we all do that. It doesn't change anything. You mess up the order of some words in the ancient language, it didn't change what it was telling us. So that was important. We looked at some of the corroborating evidence. Other writers that aren't Christians and some of the things that they wrote about Jesus back then. We looked at Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Suetonius, Pliny, Thales, Phlegon, Marabar Scripion, the Jewish Talmud, all of those writings, none of them Christians, most of them in opposition to Christianity. In fact, just with those things, Dr. Yamauchi made a list of things. If you take away the Bible, throw it out, just use these other writings that we have come up, that we just mentioned, and what they wrote about Christ, well, what they wrote about Jesus in their mind, who we know to be Christ, we would still know these things without the Bible. We would know that Jesus of Nazareth lived, that he was a Jewish teacher, that many people believed that he performed healings and exorcisms. And even his opposers didn't doubt this, because remember, they didn't say that he didn't do these things. They said what? They said he was a sorcerer, right? So they're basically admitting this guy's doing some far out crazy things that we can't explain, right? So he was a Jewish teacher. Many people believed that he did healings and exorcisms. Some people believed he was the Messiah. He was rejected by the Jewish leaders. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Despite his shameful death, his followers, who believed that he was still alive, spread beyond Palestine, so that there were multitudes of his followers in Rome by AD 64. And all kinds of people from cities and countryside, men and women, slave and free, worshiped him as God. We know that without the Bible. Other writings verify those basic things about who Jesus of Nazareth was. And I think that's important as we looked at evidence that corroborates what the Scripture tells us to be true. We spent time talking about scientific evidence. Archaeology was a big one. And we looked at some of the archaeological discoveries, many of which in our until modern times, were doubted. We talked about several places, locations that the Bible refers to that people doubted until recent times. That archaeology finds them. They find the pool of Bethesda with all of its porticos that the New Testament describes. That until then, that place doesn't even exist. So the Bible is full of hooey, right? Well, they find it, lo and behold. Now what? The city of Nazareth was believed to not exist until recent times. The Bible was the only place that they could find any records of this Nazareth until recent modern times. Oh yeah, that place did exist. And on we can go of the ways and places that archaeology supports what the Scripture already told us to be true. And we also as important. Dr. John McCrae says that archaeology has never produced anything that is a contradiction to what the Bible says. They have never uncovered something that, oh, look at this. The Bible says something totally different, and that's not happened. So archaeology constantly is supporting what we know to be true in Scripture. We looked at some other scientific evidence as well that supports our Christianity. And then we spent a few weeks looking at identity evidence. Was Jesus really the Son of God? Did he even claim to be the Son of God? What does the evidence suggest? And we, without a doubt, pinpointed that Jesus certainly made claims to those ends as to his identity. And then based on those claims, some of the psychological evidence that we then looked for, based on the fact that Jesus made these claims of who he was, that now eliminates some of the other options that people attribute to him, as to him being just that, yeah, he was a good teacher, or maybe he even was a prophet. Well, good teachers and prophets don't lie about who they are. That's the fact of the matter. So those aren't even options now. He was either the Son of God, or he was a phony, right? And that we looked at Josh McDowell's, the whole liar, lunatic, or Lord. Those are basically your options now. Once Jesus makes the claims that he made, he now can't just be a good prophet or a good teacher. He's now either a liar, he came and was totally misleading people, or he was a lunatic, meaning he was saying all these things and he thought them to be true, but they weren't, right? Or the things that he was saying were exactly true, meaning that he is the Lord. And we've got really only those three options now. Then we looked at circumstantial evidence and some identity evidence, and on we've gone. We're about out of time. I hope that this has been a bolstering for our faith as we've gone through this. Any closing comments, thoughts before we wrap things up today and start getting ready for a worship time?
We know who was responsible for consolidating the six books written over the course of 1,500 into one book. Eventually, I guess.
Yeah.
For 2,000 years ago.
That's a question I'm not necessarily prepared to answer right this second, but that's a good question. That go ahead. Okay. 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 Would that maybe be there's stuff in there that answers the question that was brought up? Yeah. Okay. Do you have an answer to your own question that you can share with us? Yeah, no, that's certainly a good question. Certainly a good question that maybe we'll have to. Absolutely.
They had these books written over this for years, and who decided, well, let's add this book this time, you know.
We did look.
Years later, they had another book.
Right, we did look at as part of one of these lessons at why are the books that we have included and there are some others that aren't. And the early church had I do know they had specific criteria that it either had to be written by an apostle or somebody that was very close to an apostle. The writings in that had to be consistent with the rest of the teachings that they were given. For example, there's a book that's attributed to Thomas. It's called the Gospel of Thomas. Technically, he was an apostle, right? So that met that criteria. So why wasn't it included? Well, first of all, it wasn't written till the year 140 AD. I don't think Thomas was still alive at that point, so maybe he had passed these down to somebody else that was writing it for him. But there were some things in there that we shared that were not consistent with the rest of Jesus' teachings, specifically teachings about women. If you remember, I shared 2 different quotes that were attributed to the Gospel of Thomas that basically, blessed are you if you have a male child, and woe to you if you have a female child type of deal. Like, that doesn't sound like what Jesus would say. And there was another one that was very anti-women. And again, we know the culture back then, but that's not how Jesus presented, even in that culture, right? He was not afraid to talk to women. The women at the well at Samaria, right? Mary Magdalene and the other women, his own mother. That's not the way he's presented in scriptures at all. So the fact that this Gospel of Thomas is contradictory to that and is dated much later than that, the early church just did not accept that into what we might call the canon of scriptures. This book that there were other writings back then that were attributed to Barnabas, Mary, that again didn't meet the early church's criteria as far as when it was written. Is it consistent with what the rest of the writings that we know about Christ? And who wrote it? Were 3 of the big ones I know. I don't know if that helped or muddied the waters at all, but there's certainly, the early church did have a set of criteria that they, there's not a Gospel of Carl, right? He wasn't alive back then to write, right? But that eliminated some of the writings. The church 200, 300 years after Christ, they come across a writing. Well, why isn't this part of the scriptures? Well, because Carl wasn't alive back then, right? How do we know that he's speaking truth, right? Other comments, questions? No kidding. Okay. Very cool. Appreciate that. We are way past time. We'll get ready for worship time. Thank you all. Appreciate all the good comments that you've had over the weeks.